Mr. President, it is with great humility and respect for the institution of the United States Senate, reverence for the many great men and women who have served here, and affection for my colleagues that I rise today to discuss what I believe is an issue of great importance. Reflecting on my first year as a member of this body, I have come to believe that we are failing to represent the best interests of the American people. We, as elected representatives, have a duty to our constituents, but partisan rancor and the Senate's own incapacitating rules often prevent us from fulfilling that duty. While I am convinced that our inability to function is our own fault, we have the authority within the Constitution to act. Article 1, Section 5 of our Constitution states in clear language that each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. This is Article 1, Section 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. In the House of Representatives, every Congress, they have a vote on the rules. Although this chamber was able to pass historic health care legislation last year, we are far from finished. More than anything, what the health care debate has demonstrated is how difficult the rules have made our legislative process. And it's not just health care. Other important pieces of legislation still languish. Federal judicial vacancies remain unfilled, and many of the President's appointees to key positions are still not confirmed. The American people deserve better. I applaud Leader Reid for what he has been able to accomplish given the way this chamber's rules have been used to impede progress. Senate rules are designed to allow for substantive debate and to protect the views of the minority, as our founders intended. But they have been used instead to prevent the Senate from beginning to even debate critical legislation. Protecting the views of the minority makes sense, but not at the expense of the will of the majority. Indeed, as the rules are being used today, a single senator can hold a bill hostage until his or her demands are met. This chart right here shows the rise of the filibuster in the Senate, in Congresses, starting back in 1919 all the way up to the present. In the 96th Congress, back in 1979, 1980, there were only 20 votes to invoke cloture. In the 100th Congress, just 7 years later, it had doubled. 2001, it had gone up to 61. But in the 110th Congress alone, there were 112 cloture votes. This is not the spirit of compromise and collegiality our founders envisioned for this body. Even worse, the rules as they exist today make any effort to change them a daunting process. Under the current standing rules of the Senate, Rule 5 states that, quote, "The rules of the Senate shall continue from one Congress to the next unless they are changed as provided in these rules," end quote. As adopted in 1975, Rule 22 requires 2/3 of senators present and voting to agree to end debate on a change to the Senate rules. In most cases, 67 votes. Taken together, these two rules effectively deny the Senate the opportunity to exercise its constitutional right to determine the rules of its proceedings, and serve to bind this body to rules adopted by its predecessors. We are all too aware of the power of Rule 22, the filibuster rule adopted in 1975. Yet, except for the distinguished Senators Byrd, Inouye, and Leahy, none of us, Republicans or Democrats alike, have ever voted to adopt this rule. Opponents of rules reform argue that the Senate is a continuing body, and therefore the rules must remain in effect from one Congress to the next. I disagree with this assertion. even if the Senate is deemed to have continued because 2/3 of its members remain in office. There is no reason that the rules must remain in effect. Many things changed with the new Congress. It's given a new number. All of the pending bills and nominations from the previous Congress are dead, and each party may choose its leadership. If the party in the majority changes, the new Senate becomes substantially different from the last. Senators of both parties have argued that the rules may change with a new Congress. As my esteemed colleague from Utah, Senator Hatch, stated in a National Review article in 2005, and I quote, "The Senate has been called a continuing body, yet language reflecting this observation was included in Senate rules only in 1959. The more important and much older sense in which the Senate is a continuing body is its ongoing constitutional authority to determine its rules. Rulings by vice presidents of both parties, sitting as the president of the Senate, confirm that each Senate may make that decision for itself, either implicitly by acquiescence or explicitly by amendment. Both conservative and liberal legal scholars, including those who see no constitutional problems with the current filibuster campaign, agree that a simple majority can change Senate rules at the beginning of a new Congress." End quote. The early history of this body suggests that the use of unlimited debate as a tool of obstruction was not an issue. The original Senate rules adopted under Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution included a provision allowing a senator to make a motion for the previous question. If passed, the motion allowed a simple majority of senators to halt debate on a pending issue. This simple rule for limiting debate was inadvertently dropped in 1806, perhaps for lack of need, and the Senate entered a period with no means to limit debate. It wasn't until the 1830s that the Senate saw the first filibusters, as members recognized that the lack of any rule to limit debate could be used to effectively block legislation opposed by even a minority of the minority. It was not, however, until 1917 that the Senate adopted a formal cloture rule. Woodrow Wilson's Armed Ships Bill had just been filibustered by 11 senators. The President was furious, demanding a change in Senate procedural rules. In response, Montana Senator Thomas Walsh, citing Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, introduced the constitutional option. Walsh argued that a newly convened Senate was not bound by the rules of the previous Senate and could adopt its own rules, including a rule to limit debate. He reasoned that every new Senate had the right to adopt rules, saying that it is preposterous to assume that the Senate may deny future majorities the right to change the rules. In response to Walsh's proposal, the Senate reached a compromise and amended Rule 22. The compromise permitted cloture on any pending measure at the will of 2/3 of all senators present and voting. Back then, the toxic partisanship we face today had not yet poisoned the system, but the manipulative use of the filibuster had already taken hold. It was used to block some of the most important legislation of that time: anti-lynching bills in 1922, 35, and 38. Anti-race discrimination bills were blocked almost a dozen times, starting in 1946. By the 1950s, a bipartisan group of senators had had enough. On behalf of himself and 18 other senators, New Mexico's Clinton Anderson, my predecessor, attempted to limit debate and control the use of a filibuster by adopting the 1917 strategy of Thomas Walsh. Just as Senator Walsh did almost 4 decades earlier, Senator Anderson argued that each new Congress brings with it a new Senate entitled to consider and adopt its own rules. On January 3, 1953, Anderson moved that the Senate immediately consider the adoption of rules for the Senate of the 83rd Congress. Anderson's motion was tabled, but he introduced it again at the beginning of the 85th Congress. In the course of that debate, Senator Hubert Humphrey presented a parliamentary inquiry to Vice President Nixon, who was presiding over the Senate. Nixon understood the inquiry to address the basic question: do the rules of the Senate continue from one Congress to another? Noting that there had never been a direct ruling on this question from the chair, Nixon stated that, quote, while the rules of the Senate have been continued from one Congress to another, the right of a current majority of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress to adopt its own rules, stemming as it does from the Constitution itself, cannot be restricted or limited by rules adopted by a majority of a previous Congress. Any provision of Senate rules adopted in a previous Congress which has the expressed or practical effect of denying the majority of the Senate in a new Congress the right to adopt the rules under which it desires to proceed is, in the opinion of the chair, unconstitutional, end quote. In 1959, Anderson raised the constitutional option again at the start of the 86th Congress, with the support of some 30 other senators. This time he raised the ire of then Majority Leader Johnson, who realized that a majority of senators might join Anderson's cause. To prevent Anderson's motion from receiving a vote, Johnson came forward with his own compromise, changing Rule 22 to reduce the required vote for cloture to 2/3 of senators present and voting. Clinton Anderson relied on the constitutional option as the basis to ease or at least reconsider the cloture requirements laid out in Rule 22. As he said in 1959, quote, my motion does not prejudge the nature of the rules which the Senate in its wisdom may adopt, but it does declare in effect that the Senate of the 85th Congress is responsible for and must bear the responsibility for the rules under which the Senate will operate. That responsibility cannot be shifted back upon the Senate of past Congresses, end quote. In 1975, 2 years after Anderson left office, the Senate adopted the rule we operate under today. It takes the vote of 3/5 of all senators duly chosen and sworn to cut off debate or the threat of unlimited debate. As the junior senator from New Mexico, I have the honor of serving in Senator Clinton Anderson's former seat, and I have the desire to take up his commitment to the Senate and his dedication to the principle that in each new Congress, the Senate should exercise its constitutional power to determine its own rules. Let me be very clear. I'm not arguing for or against any specific changes to the rules, but I do think that each Senate has the right, according to the Constitution, to determine all of its rules by a simple majority vote. As my distinguished colleague, Senator Byrd, the longest-serving member in the history of Congress, once said, quote, the Constitution in Article 1, Section 5 says that each House shall determine the rules of its proceedings. Now we are at the beginning of Congress. This Congress is not obliged to be bound by the dead hand of the past, end quote. It is time for reform. There are many great traditions in this body that should be kept and respected, but stubbornly clinging to ineffective and unproductive procedures should not be one of them. There is another way. The resolution I am introducing today is simple. It would enable the 112th Congress to carry out its responsibility to determine the rules of its proceedings in accordance with the Constitution. This is not to say that between now and the beginning of the 112th Congress, we cannot use our political will to find a way to avoid the gridlock of 2009. It is to say that at the beginning of the 112th Congress, the Senate can exercise its constitutional right to adopt its rules of procedure by a simple majority vote. The Senate may choose to adopt new rules, or it may choose to continue with some or all of the rules of the previous Congress. The point is that it is our choice. It is our responsibility.